because all of this stuff is based on data. And I feel like, especially when it comes to social media, when it comes to just really any app that you download, you give so much of yourself away without even realizing it. Like I've said this many times before, but like I cannot think of a time where I read user agreements and then said, I fully understand what I'm signing up for. I agree with this. Take everything there is from my phone and just like let me play this game of solitaire, right? Like, it's just it doesn't happen. Like, it's not realistic. And part of it is obviously a legal issue of why things like this are allowed when we're very well aware in society that no one out there is reading these user agreements. So why is it there? Because I don't believe they ever get upheld in court anyway, because judges are people and they're rational and they realize that, okay, there's no way anyone read, in this 8.5 font of like 300 pages of, and also like very difficult jargon sometimes, right? Like I'm not fully aware of all the jargon that's used in the social media industry or in the tech industry or data collections, statistics. So there could, even if I were to attempt to try to read it, the chances of me actually understanding everything fully is quite slim, because I'm confident that there's going to be things in there that are very important and very vital that I am not going to understand. So I don't know why it's allowed. I think that's a legal issue. But if you guys want to share any thoughts around that, I'm happy to hear them. But back to this whole idea of data, like, and the fact that we give so much of ourselves away, so much of our data is harvested. How do we, first of all, I suppose it can start with how do you program better so that there's less data collection, but it's also how do you change behaviors so that people are more aware, and this goes back to your critical thinking point as well, of people being aware of what they're agreeing to instead of just blindly wanting the convenience of being able to do something and clicking, yes, I agree, please proceed.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There are multiple aspects to what you mentioned. I'll address a couple. I think to your point about EULA agreements, my own perspective is that EULA is not supposed to be upheld in court. And I'm not a lawyer and, take my points of view with a grain of salt. But my perspective is EULAs are not supposed to be upheld in courts. The purpose is for the company to use the data in the way they want, knowing that when you have customers at mass, like you have an app and you have 1 million customers, it is very unlikely that any of these customers will take you to court. So the EULA will actually serve as a notice to you that I'm going to do this with your data, hoping that no one will take the company to court, because the EULA will, in my opinion, will be held in court. And the reason is, for instance, in Canada, based on FIPA, consent is only allowed if the person providing the consent understands what they're consenting to, right? So even if you understand the jargon in the EULA agreement, but since you don't know what data is being collected or how it's going to be used, still the consent that you provide is not a consent you understand. Therefore, it's meaningless. But as I said, the purpose of that EULA is not to have it legal, but just to say, hey, you're using this, I'm going to do this with your data, and you said okay, right? So it's just a way of providing a safety net, not from a legal perspective, but from a, this is what we're going to do, and this is, you said yes. So I think that's the EULA perspective. The perspective of what's being done to our data and so on, I think I want to go a step back and say data ownership in general is really, really important, right? One of the things that I want to mention is this intellectual property of artists, scholars, and just individuals with regards to their data being used in large language models, right? So, there's now all these problems where people say, we didn't consent our book to be processed by the large language model, but apparently the large language model actually read our book and it knows everything about the book without having a license to use it. Or artists are now saying all the, all of our artwork was apparently processed by this image processing application, and it's generating artwork that's very similar to our stuff. How come the intellectual property of the artist or the scholar or the writer or a single individual is not being protected? And I think that's a big question, because when you're generating content on the internet, you're not providing consent for that data to be used in any way the companies desire, right? So just think about, you're quite tired, you go home, you open Twitter, and you complain, right? About your colleagues, your work, your employer, the city, the subway, things like that. You're just complaining to your friend. You're not consenting to a third-party company to take your data and process it and then create applications that personalizes your experience. But that's what's happening, right? So there are data companies that specialize in data aggregation, and they're specialized to identify your identity across platforms. Even when you hide your identity, it's very likely, in my opinion, over 70-80% of the time, they will identify who you are based on your IP address, your location, the IMEI address on your phone. They identify all your devices or your social accounts. They connect all the dots and they sell your data to companies. But you never consented to the data being used. So I think going back to the education piece, I think personalization and your experience with technology, the smooth experience you have with technology, comes at the cost of giving away your data and your privacy. So if you think something's too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true, right? So if you have this map application that when you open it up, it says, I think you're going to work. You don't need to even put it in here. Take this route. It's much better. And you love this coffee shop and you're going to pick up coffee from this coffee shop. It's great. We love it. It's convenient, but it's coming at the cost of invading our privacy and collecting our data. And that's what they're showing you. Things they do with your data without showing you is probably, just showing you the route is probably the tip of the iceberg. Then everything else behind the scenes, in terms of your mortgage rates, in terms of your car insurance rates, in terms of, your risk of different things that you don't even know, and those are being sold to different enterprises behind the scenes without you knowing, is what's at stake. And so I think the education piece now says, is it worth it that your Google Map, or not Google Map, but some map applications will actually take you to your favorite coffee shop without asking? But they also collect data on how much you spend on coffee each day and what you eat with your coffee. Therefore, your risk of high blood sugar in your blood, and therefore being at risk of et cetera, and selling this to insurance companies that would then charge you more for you. Is it worth it? Right? And so once we understand the implications, I think as individuals, we would say, okay, maybe I don't need this app or that app. And if we collectively don't fall into the trap of having all these nice apps, maybe the business doesn't work any longer, and therefore it wouldn't be a viable business model to start collecting people's data, right? So if you're a responsible company who doesn't collect, maybe then you become profitable and people will install your app and engage with you.
Right. I mean, that is a lot. So it seems like if we want the finer things in life, we have to give up our privacy.
I mean, you don't have to. You just have to make the companies more responsible so that they don't use your data against you, or they don't collect the data, right? So Ibrahim touched up on some really good things about like the individual responsibility in privacy, right? So I wanted to comment about the two things separately. One is privacy, one is the intellectual property ownership, but they're both connected. I think, of course, there is individual, like you have to take on individual responsibility. You have to be aware of it through like awareness and education, like tying back to the previous question that we had, right? But I think governance plays a big role here as well, right? So I wanted to provide a very recent example. Have you heard about Threads, the new app?
Oh, yes.
Basically it's the Twitter competitor of
Yes.
but from Facebook, right? So you'll see there's an interesting conversation going on that Threads, the app, has not been released in Europe, right? Because in Europe, governance-wise, they came up with something called GDPR. I believe it stands for General Data Protection Regulation, right?
Yeah.
So it's pretty strict in terms of what type of data can you collect from a person's phone, right? So Threads, if you of course, in North America, we don't have as strict regulation as GDPR. So because of GDPR, since Threads is collecting a lot more data compared to, say, Twitter or some other social media apps, they haven't been able to release it. They have to adhere to the GDPR, right, to be able to release it in Europe. So governance works, right? Because of course they're gonna make changes to the app so that it adheres to GDPR, so that it can be, because Europe is a big market, right? So so you kind of have to hit the company where it hurts, and that is their bottom line. Unfortunately, that's how private companies operate anyway, right? So this is coming from the privacy point of view, right? Of course, GDPR itself has its own issues. I could go on about that, but again, it's a good start, right? But now going back to the part that's new in this generative AI hype, right? Like with ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, the image generators. Intellectual property, right? Because basically now the definition of intellectual property needs to be refined there as well. Again, from a regulation and governance point of view, right? Because artwork, art has been derivative, like humans do derivative art as well, right? So the proponents of AI, they will say that, oh, humans do it all the time. Why can't an AI do it, right? But there is a difference, right? With AI, what you can do is you can actually generate, exactly follow an artist's style, just make minute changes, right? And then just and the problem is you can create 1,000 copies of that in seconds, right? So the scale of it is basically enormous, right? So why would someone pay that artist when you can do it for free by just putting in that a landscape in the style of this artist, right? So why would you even bother going to that artist, right? So the artist's right needs to be protected here, right? And also, so this again comes from a governance point of view, right? Of course, now there are some tools out there where you can say, you can try to opt out of that. Okay, my art should not be used to train an AI model, right? But the problem is, again, the responsibility is on the individual to do it, right? Now, instead of in addition to that, if we have a governance model where we say that, okay, if your art is, say, it's very hard to do technologically, but if we could, that if your art is too similar to this artist, you have to either pay this artist or the AI model cannot generate this art. If we had something like that from a governance point of view, so that we can enforce the companies to do it, only then intellectual property of creatives will be protected, right? And besides all that, do we really want to live in a world where just AI spits out very mediocre art and mediocre stories that doesn't even make any sense, right? So that's another point too, right? So
it's interesting because there's actually been fierce debates as of late on, is AI generated art actually art? Right. And I find those conversations to be quite fascinating. But it is important to note that this is something that firms are aware of as well. So, for instance, if you, I believe they started with celebrities, but if you were to go and upload a celebrity's picture and try to configure it or, change it somehow, do modifications to it, a lot of times they won't let you. It'll say, no, this goes against our policies. We don't do this type of thing. So I think that's a positive step. At least they are aware of it and they are trying to fix the issue.